On the night of December 9th, 1979, a 51-year-old man stood at the railing of the Soviet cruise ship Ilyich. His name was Yuri Vetokhin. 30 kilometers of black, empty water separated him from the Indonesian coast, and from a freedom the Soviet state had officially classified as a disease. Because years earlier, state doctors had given his wish to leave a clinical name, sluggish schizophrenia. He was about to spend the next 20 hours proving them wrong, or drowning in the attempt. For Yuri Vetokhin, freedom had a sound. It was the low groan of a ship's hull turning to the open sea, the sharp cry of a gull against the wind. It was any sound that was not the scrape of a chair in a Leningrad office. He was a navigator by trade and by soul, a graduate of the Leningrad Naval Academy. In the early 1950s, he was an officer in the Soviet Pacific Fleet based in Vladivostok. For a man with no family, the sea was a reliable parent. His own were gone, swallowed by the Leningrad blockade of '42. The ocean asked for nothing but competence. It did not demand loyalty oaths or study circles. It only demanded you knew how to read the stars and how to stay alive. On land, the rules were different. In 1951, he had tried to build a life against the shore. He married a woman named Tatyana Ivanovna, but the shore had its own politics, its own currents of fear. In 1954, she reported him, denounced him to the party organization of his own military unit. The charge, anti-Soviet remarks. A private conversation turned into a public condemnation. The betrayal was absolute. By 1955, the marriage was over. The shore had proven it could not be trusted. So he retreated, not to the sea, but deeper into the landlocked world he now despised. By the 1960s, the sea charts and the sextant were gone, replaced by circuit diagrams and humming machines. He became the chief engineer at a computing center in Leningrad, a cage of logic and wires. He was good at it, precise, methodical, but every calculation was a reminder of the one equation he could not solve: how to get back to the water. The navigator was navigating a world without a horizon, and he was suffocating. For a navigator, there is only one sin, losing your way. Yuri Vetokhin had spent his life reading the stars, the currents, the soul of the water. He believed the sea was his ally, his only path to freedom. The night of August 13th, 1963 was the test. The Black Sea was violent, a storm churning the water into a cold, black chaos. Perfect. No patrols would risk this weather. From the shores of Batumi in Soviet Georgia, the lights of Turkey were a distant, fragile promise. Just a few kilometers of swimming. He slipped into the waves. The cold was a physical shock, a predator's bite. But Yuri was prepared, a trained navigator, a strong swimmer. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. Each stroke was a calculation, each breath a tiny victory against the Soviet state. He was leaving, he was erasing himself. But the sea has its own allegiances. The storm was not just cover, it was a liar. The waves he thought were his shield became his cage. The currents he had studied turned against him. In the roaring darkness, under a sky with no stars, the navigator was blind. Every instinct screamed he was moving south, toward freedom, toward Turkey. He swam for hours. His muscles burned. His lungs begged for air. He was fueled by a single image, a life where his thoughts were his own. When the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, he saw land. But the shoreline felt wrong. The buildings were too familiar, too Soviet. He had not been moving south. The current, in a final cruel irony, had dragged him north. Deeper into the empire, he had landed near Poti, further from Turkey than when he began. He was arrested on the beach on August 14th. A navigator delivered by the sea back to his jailers. They held him for 8 days, 8 days of questions, of veiled threats. And then they let him go. A warning, a leash, pulled tight, then loosened. They thought the sea had taught him a lesson. They thought he would be grateful. They were wrong. It was just the first rehearsal. 4 years passed in silence. 4 years of careful work, of saving money, of studying maps in secret. The Black Sea was patient. Yuri Vetokhin was patient too. The failure at Batumi was not an end. It was, as he had been told, just the first rehearsal. The second attempt was planned with surgical precision. The date, July 12, 1967. The location, the southern coast of Crimea. A place he hoped would be less guarded, a shore that promised a different outcome. But the state's memory is long, and its eyes are everywhere. This time there was no gentle warning, no 8-day detention. The border patrol was waiting. The sound of boots on wet pebbles, the cold metal of the rifle, the finality in their voices. He was arrested. The protocol for such a crime was clear. An interrogation, a trial for illegal border crossing, a guaranteed sentence in a labor camp. This is what Yuri expected. It was the known price of failure, but the state had other plans. A more modern solution. The file on Yuri Vetokhin was not sent to a prosecutor's office. It was sent to a commission. Its members were not lawyers or judges. They were doctors. The state had arrived at a new, chillingly elegant logic. A sane, healthy Soviet citizen does not wish to leave paradise. Therefore, a desire to escape the Soviet Union was not a political crime. It was a symptom, a pathology, a sign of a diseased mind. Yuri Vetokhin was not going to a labor camp. He was being sent for an evaluation. The journey into the center of the machine began on steel wheels. From the holding cells of Kharkov and Kherson, Yuri Vetokhin was transferred. Destination: Moscow. First, the Butyrka prison, then Lefortovo, the KGB's own grim fortress of concrete and silence. He was no longer a local problem. He was state-level paperwork. He expected a trial, a prosecutor, a judge, a verdict with a number attached. 5 years. 10. Something to count down. Instead, he was taken to a different kind of court. The Serbsky All-Union Institute for Forensic Psychiatry. It had a formal name, but everyone knew what it was. And they especially knew about its most secret, most feared section, Department 4E, the political wing. This was the place where the state did not break your bones, but your mind. Where dissent was not a crime, but a symptom, and a symptom could be treated indefinitely. This was not a prison, it was an institution. Here the questions were different. They did not ask him what he did. They asked him why he thought it. They examined his unshakable belief that a citizen should be allowed to leave his own country. They listened to his meticulous logical arguments. They saw no remorse. They saw only his reformist delusions. In March of 1968, the commission delivered its verdict, not on a court order, but on a medical chart. Yuri Vetokhin was declared legally insane. The diagnosis, vялотекущая schizophrenia, sluggish schizophrenia, a uniquely Soviet invention. Its primary symptom, a fixed, obsessive desire to change the system. There would be no trial, no fixed sentence, only compulsory treatment, until he was cured. There are places worse than prisons. They are called Hospitals. Yuri Vetokhin was not sent to the infamous Leningrad Special Psychiatric Hospital, the one whispered about in dissident circles. He was sent to Dnepropetrovsk, a place designed to be forgotten, taking with it the men inside. Here the treatment began. It was not meant to cure. It was meant to break. First, the insulin shocks, a calculated overdose that plunges the body into a seizure, a chemical drowning of the mind. You wake up not knowing your own name, every muscle screaming from the convulsions. The goal was simple: to erase the man you were. Then came the sulfur. Injections of sulfazine, a compound that does nothing but create pain. It ignites a fever that climbs past 104 degrees. Your joints feel filled with broken glass. For days, you're just a vessel of agony. This wasn't medicine. It was a medieval torture, administered with a sterile needle. And then, haloperidol, the chemical straitjacket. It didn't calm the mind. It locked it in a cage. Yuri's muscles would seize, his jaw clamping shut so hard he feared his teeth would shatter. A constant, uncontrollable tremor took over his hands. His thoughts, once sharp, now moved through a thick gray fog. He would try to form a sentence, and the words would dissolve before they reached his lips. But the true torture was not in the needle. It was in the logic. A perfect, unbreakable circle. To be released, Yuri had to prove he was sane. But any protest against his diagnosis, any claim that he was healthy, was recorded in his file as a primary symptom: lack of critical insight. The very act of defending his sanity was proof of his madness. To get out, he had to agree with them. He had to say the words, "I am ill." He had to look a doctor in the eye, a man methodically destroying him, and confess to a disease he did not have. To insist he was sane meant staying forever. To admit he was insane meant they had won. It meant the death of the person he was. In the suffocating quiet of the Dnepropetrovsk Special Psychiatric Hospital, Yuri Vetokhin understood a truth more brutal than any diagnosis. The state was not an opponent you could defeat with logic. It was a wall, and when you cannot break a wall, you must find the door, even if that door requires you to lie, to say you are not who you are. The struggle was over. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, internal surrender. He stopped arguing. He stopped demanding his rights. He began to play the part of a man recovering from a sickness he never had. He spoke of his delusions with a rehearsed shame. He nodded when they called his thoughts a clinical symptom. He was the perfect patient, agreeing with the perfect absurdity, that a desire for freedom was a chemical imbalance in the brain. It was a performance for an audience of one, the psychiatrist holding the key. And slowly, the system began to believe its own fiction. On September 23, 1975, he was deemed stable enough for transfer, not to freedom, but to a lower security hospital in Leningrad. One step closer. For another year, he held his breath. He maintained the fiction. He became a ghost in his own body, waiting. Then, on a gray afternoon, September 15, 1976, it happened. A file was opened. A doctor, a man whose name is lost to history, picked up a pen. With a single signature, he declared Yuri Vetokhin cured of the illness of wanting to be somewhere else. Yuri walked out into the cold Leningrad air. He returned to work. He was a free man. But inside, a promise remained, silent and absolute. The cure was a lie. And the sea was still waiting. He returned to the sea, the same sea they had tried to turn into a weapon against him. For months, Yuri Vetokhin worked, saved, and planned. He did not speak of his diagnosis. He did not speak of the hospital. He was a model employee, a man cured by the state. In 1979, he purchased a ticket for a cruise. The ship was named Ilyich. 500 tourists on a pleasure trip from Vladivostok past the shores of Japan and the Philippines, down to the equator and back. A perfect Soviet holiday. On the night of December 9th, the Ilyich was adrift, a silent, sleeping vessel in the Molucca Sea, roughly 30 kilometers from the nearest Indonesian islands. The air was warm, the water below, black. He did not hesitate. There was no grand speech, no final look back, just the quiet calculus of a man who had measured the cost. 8 meters from the deck to the water, 30 kilometers of ocean to the nearest shore, an entire state security apparatus behind him, and one single silent opportunity in front. He slipped over the railing. For a single second, there was only the sound of the air rushing past. He did not close his eyes. He needed to see the water that would save him, then the impact, the cold shock, and the silence as the ship's lights began to shrink, becoming a distant, indifferent star. He had to breathe, and then he swam. For what felt like an eternity, the salt burned his eyes. His muscles screamed, first in protest, then in a dull, constant agony. The darkness was absolute. He wasn't swimming in water. He was swimming through a universe of black, with no up and no down. Only the rhythm of his own arms against the current. The taste of salt and exhaustion filled his mouth. This was the real treatment. Not the chemicals they had pumped into his veins, but this. The ocean, washing away the hospital, the interrogations, the diagnosis. Every stroke was an erasure. For 20 hours. Then, through the blur of exhaustion and salt water, a shape, darker than the sky. Not a cloud, not a wave, a line. It was land. The island did not rise from the sea. It grew out of his will to see it. He swam harder, on the last reserves of strength, fueled by a sight he was told he would never see again. Freedom. After reaching the shore of Indonesia, and after the necessary legal formalities, Yuri Vetokhin was granted political asylum. In early 1980, he moved to the United States. He settled in San Diego. The navigator had found his ocean. Yuri Vetokhin lived the rest of his life in the United States. He wrote a book of memoirs titled Inclined to Escape. He worked, he aged, and in 2022, he died in California, his story almost entirely unknown. The files close, the gates open. But the prison doesn't always stay behind. The Soviet psychiatric system had a goal more sophisticated than a simple cage. It wasn't enough to lock a man's body away. The true victory was to make him sign a confession against his own mind. To make him agree in his own handwriting that his sanity was a sickness. The ultimate irony of Yuri's escape is that to prove he was sane enough to be released, he first had to admit he was insane. The state's ledger books are gone, but the ledgers we keep inside ourselves, the quiet accounting of what we traded for survival, those never close. They are a catalogue of invisible scars. The Soviet Union seems like a distant artifact, a machine of iron and concrete. But the mechanism it perfected was psychological. It understood that most of us will surrender a piece of ourselves to stop the pain. We admit we were wrong when we know we were right. We apologize for truths we believe in. We call our own reason a mistake to keep a job, to keep the peace, to keep a family from breaking. We sign our own small confessions every day. And so the question this case leaves us with is not about him. It is about us. If the state, the doctors, the guards, if everyone you met told you that your simple desire to be free was a symptom of a disease, and the only prescription was to agree, how long could you hold on to the belief that you were sane? If this story stayed with you, you already know what to do. Subscribe, not because I'm asking, but because somewhere out there is a story made for you, and I don't want you to miss it. An empire kept its secrets for 70 years. I'm not letting it keep them any longer. I am the storyteller, and this is the Soviet Noir.